Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for tonight's lecture, Looking Back, Planning Ahead, Curating 50 Years of the Museum at FIT. We've muted all participants' microphones on entry, so please keep your microphones off during the presentation. There will be time for questions at the end of the lecture, so please save your questions until the end, at which time please feel free to unmute to ask questions or to place your questions in the chat if you prefer. My name is Jennifer Farley-Gordon, and I'm the digital curator at the Textiles and Clothing Museum. On behalf of the TCM, I'm delighted to welcome Colleen Hill as tonight's guest speaker. Colleen Hill is curator of costume and accessories at the museum at FIT. She holds an MA in Fashion and Textile Studies, History, Theory, Museum Practice from FIT, and is currently a PhD candidate at London College of Fashion. Since joining MFIT in 2006, Hill has curated or co-curated more than a dozen exhibitions. Her most recent exhibitions include Reinvention and Restlessness, Fashion in the 90s, which is currently on view, and Ravishing, The Rose in Fashion. She's authored or co-authored 8 books on fashion and contributed to numerous other publications. Colleen, thank you so much for being here tonight.
Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to be here. Thank you so much for having me. I'm just going to go ahead and launch right in, and hopefully you all will be able to see my screen if I can find PowerPoint. There we go. Okay, so there we go. Can you see my screen? Good to go? Okay, great. Thank you. Well, again, thank you so much for having me. This is, I believe, the last show that I was able to work on pre-COVID. So it worked a little differently than my more recent exhibitions, which opened in August and January, respectively. But it was a particularly fun exhibition to work on because, as you can see, it was celebrating 50 years of the museum at FIT, and I'll give you a really brief history of the institution. But it was basically a show that allowed us to really consider our own history, of course, but also where fashion exhibitions have been and where we hope they'll be in the future. And I think that the museum at FIT staff over really generations at this point really helped to lay the foundation for some of the excitement that we feel about fashion exhibitions today. So although I'm speaking about this exhibition and the book that corresponded to the show that came out with Skira a few years ago was edited by the museum director and chief curator, Valerie Steele, and myself, this was really a group effort. Really all exhibitions are, but this was a group effort in the sense that the full curatorial staff was really working together. And one of the things that was so fun about the show was that it was a real mix in the way that we researched and curated, because typically one or two people will come up with an idea and then they'll take various steps to select their objects or do their primary research. But in this instance, of course, we were looking at our own history, and many people had different memories and ideas about what shows were that had been passed down. So there was a lot of sort of sifting through fact and fiction and figuring out what was really the most important story to tell about our history. So before I get into how we ended up selecting the 33 exhibitions that we highlighted in the exhibitionism show, I'll give you a really quick history of the institution itself. We are, of course, part of the Fashion Institute of Technology, and the museum has technically been in existence since 1969, so that's where the 50-year anniversary mark comes in. But we functioned quite differently when we were founded in 1969. We were initially known as the Design Lab, and we were a resource that was for both students and, of course, faculty and staff at the college, but also for designers. And so it's really important to remember that this was a different era. The idea of collecting fashion was quite different. It wasn't that it wasn't respected, but fashion as a commercial venture and as, of course, something that was meant to be worn was looked at and handled quite differently. So I've included a couple of photographs here. This is collections storage as I knew it when I started working at the museum at FIT in 2006. Um, this was one of two spaces. All of our collections are on site. We have about 50,000 pieces, so we've grown quite quickly, and it's a really strong collection. But those objects were really retrofitted into these existing spaces. And so we kind of did the best we can, but as you can see, the image on the right has things like carpeting. It has these cases and cabinets that weren't initially intended for museum objects, etc. And all of this kind of comes from this history of the objects being part of a design lab, something that in some instances you could actually check items out, take them back to your design studio if you were a designer, and then later return them. So a very, very different way of looking at collections. As we evolved, and as you'll see, as our ways of exhibiting fashion evolved, the way that we started thinking about garments changed a lot as well. So fortunately, about 10 years ago, we were able to get a significant amount of funding to completely overhaul our collections. So that's what you see on the bottom. These are all high quality museum standard storage spaces. Everything was revamped, even the flooring, as you can see here. So the way that we think about our objects has for quite a number of years been at high museum standards. Now our storage spaces really match that. But we've been collecting for 50 years. The collections have continued to evolve and grow. And so thinking about where these objects came from that we ended up putting in the exhibitionism show was really a fun part of the process. So I'm going to launch into kind of how we did this. And I've included just one page of this working file that I consulted again and again when working on this show. This is actually started by a colleague of mine who started looking at all of the various titles of exhibitions that we had, any dates, as you can see, where they might have been on campus because the places that we displayed fashion have also changed. And then the types of information we had about those, going all the way back in this instance to 1967, you can imagine that files are kind of spotty. Sometimes we had images, sometimes we didn't. So we started keeping track of all of this. This is something like a 50-page document. It's absolutely huge. Thankfully, it's digital, so I can easily search it. But we were constantly referencing this and updating it. And essentially, this was our starting point for trying to grapple both with how many exhibitions we'd had, which is frankly still kind of a nebulous thing. We say more than 200, it's probably closer to 3. And the reason that we're not entirely certain is because the exhibitions just function much differently. Sometimes they were in a lobby, sometimes they were in an actual gallery. Sometimes we just didn't know about them at all, and then suddenly we'd come across something in the New York Times and add it in. So there's a lot of missing information, a lot of gaps in this history, but nonetheless, this project really helped us to fill in some of that information, as you can see here. And even in the has publication notes field, a lot of that information comes from the library, from the special collections unit of FIT's library. So again, it's really this kind of collaborative effort, even more so than the typical exhibition. So one of the things that I didn't realize when I began working on this show was that one of the exhibitions, quote unquote, that I had heard a lot about was an early and important show on the designer Adrian. And for those of you who may not be familiar, I'll just give you a really quick rundown of Adrian's history because it is important to the way I'm speaking about this exhibition. He was both a ready-to-wear and a custom clothing designer beginning in the 1940s. But prior to that, he was primarily known as the costume designer for MGM Studios. and he costumed hundreds of films. He was very prominent in that field. And we have at the museum a really amazing, excuse me, collection of both Adrian garments, Adrian fashions, and also some of his costumes. It's strange that we have some of the costumes because that is not what we collect. But like many museums, things have come in and, over decades. The mission of what a museum does and collects changes over time. So it's not entirely unusual to have something that's really great. I love that we have his costumes, but is nonetheless not really part of what the type of thing that we would collect today. So, as we started looking into this show, it turns out that what was known as the Adrian Retrospective was, in fact, not a fashion exhibition, it was a runway show. And this is really important because it takes place in 1971. It's about 25 to 30 years after Adrian's heyday. So, of course, these clothes are not new, they're original 30s and 40s Adrian garments. And I mention all of this because the idea of museum collections of fashion being used for runway shows was something that was certainly quite prevalent all the way through the 1970s. It doesn't start to shift until the 80s and 90s. Now it would be a really terrible thing for a museum to do. Pretty well known that that's not museum practice. So all of these ideas really start to shift. But in 1971, the idea of having an Adrian runway show to raise funds for the college was perfectly legitimate and, in fact, very exciting. So, the story behind this is that the director of the design lab, Robert Riley, put out a call by speaking to a prominent fashion journalist who said, FIT wants to do a retrospective on Adrian. Contact Robert Riley if you have any of your Adrian clothing. As I mentioned, this was about 25, 30 years later, but women loved their Adrian. So many of them still had these garments. And they came flooding in from all over the country. What is really great about this story, I'll switch to our next slide, is that it wasn't just Adrian's fashions that came into the museum, it was also some of his costumes. And in fact, MGM was purportedly doing some kind of big clean out. Again, this was 1971, so the idea of even the most precious movie costumes kind of being in the way was there. And they were actually getting ready to throw some of these costumes away, which seems unbelievable to me now, but was certainly the case in the early 70s. And so they ended up contacting the museum at FIT and, well, what was then known as the design lab, and saying, we have these costumes, do you want them? So this is how we ended up with this amazing costume, for example, and several others by Adrian that we're quite proud of, even though, again, they don't entirely fit into our collecting mission today. So these are the types of stories that we really like to explore and sort of get to the bottom of as we were working on this exhibition. None of us who was working on exhibitionism was part of the Museum of the Design Lab in 1971. So of course, we're looking back and sharing stories and sharing what we heard from former curators or other staff, etc. And so I'm kind of going to go back and forth here, which I hope isn't too confusing, between some of the original ways that things were shown in the instance of the Adrian Runway show. I don't really have photographs of that, but in other instances, I'll be showing you the original way that the exhibition was shown versus the way that we showed it in exhibitionism. So basically, as we started to go through this massive list of past exhibitions, we first started highlighting those that we'd heard a lot about. And basically, if we're hearing about these shows that took place in the 70s or the 80s, kind of well before the time that many of us were working at the museum, that probably means that they had some sort of important legacy, some interesting stories behind them. Perhaps in the case of Adrian, were something that resulted in really important acquisitions. So we started highlighting those and kind of went from there to whittle down what would be most important. And the overall look of the exhibitionism show was fairly simple. We did these little vignettes. Every vignette had the date of the original exhibition, a little bit of the story behind it, who worked on the show. So in this instance, Robert Riley. And then we did something that we don't normally do, which is actually highlight what other exhibitions these objects were used in, if any. And we thought that was quite important because oftentimes museums, even when they have large collections, as ours does, end up using the same objects numerous times. And there's always a reason for that. I mean, often as curators, we gravitate towards the same objects because they tend to be those that tell the greatest story about the designer or a particular time period or a certain style. And so, although we really try to use new things in every single exhibition, sometimes there's a lot of overlap. So, we wanted to highlight this idea of, one object, multiple narratives, which I think is really important to the curatorial process. Just before I switch over, obviously that's the Camille dress on the right that I showed you in the previous image, on the left, but on the right is an Adrian suit. So that's actually the type of either custom or ready to wear ensemble, fashion related ensemble that he was most known for in the 1940s. So one of my favorites for numerous reasons was Paul Poiret, King of Fashion, which, as you can see, took place in 1976. And this is largely considered the first major fashion exhibition held at FIT. It's really quite extraordinary. And the space that you see here is the same space that you'll see in a lot of later slides. The 21st century exhibitions, in many cases, will be held in the same space. It's basically a big box, so you can do a lot with it. It has very high ceilings. So it's really interesting for me to see the transformation here because most importantly, this space that you see in the center is a working fountain, which I find really charming, but also something that our conservator would absolutely never let us get away with now. Our clothing could never be so close to water. But it's fun to see, again, how when clothing was viewed a little more loosely during this time period, it's interesting to see how it was used. In any case, the idea of an exhibition on Paul Poiret was another thing that surprised me when I learned about this show. Our director was really familiar with this exhibition and the premise behind it. It's another one of the shows that was organized by Robert Riley, the director of the Design Lab. And the story behind this is that Robert Riley went to France on vacation and he ended up meeting Paul Poiret's widow, former wife, Denise Poiret, who is also his muse. And he was really charmed by her. The family still had a number of garments, and he decided that he wanted to do an exhibition on Poiret. What I found really surprising about this was that purportedly he came back to the United States and he said to his colleagues at FIT, I'm going to do an exhibition on Poiret. And everyone looked at him and said, who's that? And now Poiret is considered universally, I think, one of the kings of early 20th century fashion. So it's quite unusual that he wouldn't have been well known, but apparently that was the case in at least the mid 1970s. And purportedly, Robert Riley's exhibition really helped people to, at least in the US, to understand Poiret's significance. It also resulted in some really great acquisitions. So again, in the central water feature here, this is a mannequin that looks like Poiret, and the female mannequin seated next to him was meant to look like Denise Poiret. Poiret's ensemble is a replica. Denise Poiret is wearing something that she did not actually wear herself, but we were able to acquire this wonderful fancy dress costume, again through Robert Riley's connections. And also the same woman wore this beautiful evening ensemble. Her daughter ended up giving both of these to the museum. So these are the types of things that would be absolutely impossible to find today. So it's really wonderful to hear how they were acquired in the early days, because they really are some of our most precious garments. And then here I've shown how these were featured in exhibitionism. And the cape on the right is kind of a long story, but another object that we were able to more or less identify for this show. It had sort of not been known for a couple of decades. So this is a really interesting approach to both selecting the exhibitions, but also having to select exhibitions, frankly, based on what we had, because we didn't want to engage with loans again. But many of these shows, I mean, a lot of the things that we see in this larger exhibition photo were on loan. It's only a few of these objects that end up in the permanent collection. And so those were what we really had to rely on. So in some instances, there were exhibitions that we felt we couldn't replicate appropriately because we just didn't have the objects, and therefore we're selecting something else to show instead, another exhibition to highlight. This show on Givenchy from 1982 is another quite interesting story, particularly as far as the history of fashion exhibitions goes. So this was celebrating Givenchy's 30th anniversary, and we worked directly with Hubert de Givenchy to put this together. So again, this is an exhibition that involved a lot of loans. None of the things you see in this slide belong to us. So in many instances, I've actually intentionally selected images from the original exhibition that are different from what we included in exhibitionism, so you can get a little sense of the breadth of objects in the shows. So in this instance, as I mentioned, working with Givenchy directly, there was a lot of really interesting press and kind of PR in general that surrounded this exhibition. There was a special runway show that I believe took place at Bloomingdale's. That was sort of a Givenchy sponsored thing in tandem with FIT. There was a special collection that was released, again, as a sort of celebratory collaboration between the college and Givenchy. And all of this was quite fascinating because this predates a really famous exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum of Art that was centered on the work of Yves Saint Laurent. And that exhibition in 1983 is often cited as the first fashion exhibition to highlight a living designer's work. As you can see, that is not the case. And in many ways, the Saint Laurent exhibition mirrored the Givenchy show. There was a lot of the same kind of press, a lot of the same focus on more contemporary garments, meaning that there were very recent collections featured in these shows rather than a lot of older pieces over the course of these designers' careers. And all of that at the Met was considered extremely controversial, highly commercial, and there was a lot of criticism to the point where the Met did not do another show that was really focused on a single designer for decades. And the interesting thing is the college, FIT, didn't receive the same kind of criticism. So it really seems like we as a fashion institution could, quote unquote, get away with focusing on a single designer, a single living designer. But something like the Met, which is, of course, a really prestigious art museum, received a lot of criticism for doing the same thing. So it was a really sort of interesting moment in fashion exhibition history. And here I've shown two of the cocktail dresses that we acquired from the designer into our permanent collection. So we were able to show these as a sort of replication of that original show. And another show that, excuse me, by this point is really the genius of the curators, Richard Martin and Harold Coda, was a show called Three Women. And this was a show that I heard a lot about. And we have a really great way of being able to see what exhibitions a garment has been part of over its history within our database, which is always something I'm interested in, just to see, kind of how things were viewed and what sorts of topics they fit into over time, etc. And a lot of our coolest stuff from Comme des Garçons, from Rei Kawakubo and Madeleine Vionnet and Claire McCardle was featured in this show in 1987. And I always thought it was a strange pairing of designers, but the more I thought about it, and of course, the more I researched for this exhibition, the more I understood it. And in fact, I believe it was Valerie again who knew the history behind why Rei Kawakubo, Claire McCardle, and Madeleine Vionnet were featured together in this show. And purportedly, the story behind it is that we, meaning the college, was teaching some students about Rei Kawakubo's work in the 1980s, and some of them had no idea who she was, and she had already been pretty entrenched in the European and American fashion system for a number of years by that point. But she just wasn't on some students' radar. And apparently, a professor said, "You must know her work because she's the 1980s version of Madeleine Vionnet or Claire McCardle." And they were getting to the fact that these, of course, were all women, but they were also really viewing women's bodies in a very particular and innovative way in their own eras. So somebody like Madeleine Vionnet, who really helps to launch the idea of the bias cut in really original ways, not the inventor of that certainly, but someone who really helped to show its possibilities in fashion. Um, Claire McCardle, who was creating clothing that had that real American sportswear appeal, but was also highly wearable, extremely flattering, both working within the fashionable silhouette and doing something completely other at the same time. And of course, Rei Kawakubo, who in so many ways was challenging the norms of the female body. And so you can really start to see the connections, even though in theory their work doesn't look a whole lot like each other. But I think that hearing about the premise of this show, it really started to come together. And this image on the left, I absolutely love because this is the same space that I showed you from the Poiret exhibition. Somehow they got this magical concrete block floor that I absolutely love. We've never done anything quite like this again with our flooring. But also, again, it shows you how different it must have been to experience these fashion exhibitions because the mannequins are just there. So you could just walk right up to them, which is very cool, but unfortunately for security reasons, not something that we would ever be able to do today. And then on the right, there is some Vionnet grouped together. And then we just showed one example from each of these designers, again, that was both featured in the original exhibition and is now part of our permanent collection. So continuing in the museum's history, particularly with the brilliant minds of Richard Martin and Harold Coda, this was one of their most famous exhibitions, Fashion and Surrealism, which is a really important show that showed, of course, the crossover between fashion and art. And it had all sorts of really quirky and fun vignettes. As you can see on the top left, that's our sort of under the sea section. On the bottom right, these eye-focused garments were in this sort of tiled bathroom. One of my favorites, which unfortunately there does not seem to be any photos of, was a large banquet table that was covered in all sorts of accessories that looked like food, so like cabbage hats, which I thought was really cute and fun. But all of this like kind of play with the shape of fashion, disembodied body parts, all of these sort of tropes, if you will, of surrealism that they were playing with in really fun ways. I love these like lobsters that are hanging out under the sea. And so this had an accompanying book. It was a really, really well received and reviewed show because people really started to see that fashion exhibitions could be both highly entertaining, but also really educational. People were learning about a really important movement in art and seeing how that could so easily cross over into both contemporary and historic fashion. So here are some examples that we've seen already, but I wanted to include these because I think this is really important in that, again, it shows a real breadth of fashion history. It really kind of mixes up time periods in a way that I think was really important because it's something that, again, we see a lot in fashion exhibitions that are thematic like this today. So we have our Charles James dress from 1940. Behind that, which I have not identified, but I should have, is a reprint of a sketch by Antonio, who's essentially taking the idea of this quote unquote lobster dress by Charles James, and it's this series that he calls Metamorphosis. So he basically starts with the dress and then shows how that morphs into this high heeled shoe, which I think is quite brilliant and also, of course, very surreal. We have the feet-shaped shoes from Pierre Cardin. We have a handbag with a molded hand. And then this idea of eyes as a real motif within surrealist fashion, and this great hand-painted suit by Larry Shocks, which is the kind of thing that we acquired for this exhibition, and that again would be some, it's real truly a one-of-a-kind piece that would be very, very difficult to find today. So it's really great to be able to go back to these things as we move into new exhibitions. And this is one that Professor Gordon and I think both love. Hello again, Recycling for the Real World. And I'll talk in a minute about part of our love for this show. But one of the things that made it so special was that it's, of course, all about recycling in the mid 1990s when this push for recycling all sorts of materials is really starting to come to the forefront. This is really when we're starting to think about environmentalism and sustainability in numerous design fields. And I've included a photo here that is focused on fashion because, of course, that's what you would expect in a fashion museum. But in fact, in the mid to late 1990s, after Richard Martin and Harold Coda left the museum at FIT, which was by then the museum at FIT, to work at the Met, we had a director who broadened our focus a bit. So she was interested in both fashion, but also in kind of design in general. So in fact, Hello Again, Recycling for the Real World had all kinds of recycled goods. It had, for example, a lamp that had been fashioned from an old thermos. So there was a whole kind of home goods section to this. But importantly for us now, we still only collected fashion. And some of the pieces that you see here are essential to our collection today. And I have used some of these numerous times because I really love the idea of reuse, what we would now call upcycled fashion. And it's something that I've come to again and again in my own work. In fact, two of these things in this image are on view in an exhibition I have up now about 1990s fashion. So again, these have been really integral to our permanent collection. But as you can guess, this was just all about the unique ways that people were reusing existing goods. So it is more about upcycling, but was referred to as recycling at this point. And this is a little bit of an anomaly in the way that we focused on these objects within exhibition,ism, but I think this is quite important too. Again, Professor Gordon and I, we used to work on a lot of shows together. We co-curated a number of exhibitions. And we worked on a show called Eco Fashion Going Green that I think was in 2010, 11. Must have been 2010. And we kind of combined the idea of eco-fashion going green with hello again, because again, these two objects on the right were things that we used in both shows. And so it kind of shows this fluidity in ideas. We're coming back to the idea of recycled or upcycled fashion, but viewing that in a different way in the 21st century than we did in the 1990s, and kind of showing the evolution of that idea. So we kind of grouped these together in the exhibitionism show. So as we get into the late 1990s and early 21st century, this is the time period that our current director and chief curator, Valerie Steele, comes on board. And Dr. Steele started out as our chief curator. She becomes director a few years later, so she's always been my director, but she started out really strong and has continued as such, as you will see. And she has a lot of knowledge of Chinese culture. So one of her first major exhibitions was China Chic East meets West. And this was a really interesting exhibition for a few reasons. The interest in Chinese fashion during the 90s was quite profound for a couple of reasons. One is that it's no longer under Hong Kong is no longer under the rule of Britain. Beginning in 1997. So that's a really important shift in the history of Chinese culture. But also, China is really starting to be viewed as an economic powerhouse. So these are some of the reasons that within 90s fashion and culture, China becomes so important and has continued to be as such. But Valerie took a longer look at this. So, for example, the image that you see on the left, these are all garments by Yves Saint Laurent from the 1970s. Unfortunately, these are not in our collection, but he was very much inspired by Chinese fashion. And on the right, what she wanted to show in this exhibition was that it's not only about European and American designers being inspired by China, but also Chinese fashion being inspired by Western fashion. So the garments that you see on the image on the right are cheongsams, which are essentially a kind of interesting mix of Chinese menswear, Chinese women's wear, and a sort of 1920s kind of flapper aesthetic that comes from the United States and Europe. So it's this really fascinating hybrid garment that we now consider to be quote unquote traditional, but in fact isn't, and has a reasonably short history and a really kind of interesting mix of references. And here's how we showed just a few of these garments from the exhibition in exhibitionism. One of my favorites is the dress that's on the far left there by Vivian Tam. That shows a number of parodic images of Chairman Mao, and this was from her really famous Mao collection in 1995. Again, I've used this in my 90s exhibition, and this has a really fascinating history because Chairman Mao was, of course, a dictator. He's responsible for the deaths of thousands of people, not someone who is beloved by many people in China. So this was actually considered to be a really controversial collection, and in fact still is. I tried to print a photograph of this dress in my book on 90s fashion, which was printed in China, and they censored this dress. So I thought that was really fascinating to note, and again, something that is so great to note and kind of document, because the way that garments are viewed and the controversies and the meanings behind them, of course, evolve, but in some ways they don't. And so, of course, we didn't use the image. I completely respect that, but it was really fascinating to see this kind of history play out. And Valerie is also, in my opinion, the expert on corsets. And she really started researching corsetry and lingerie when she was getting her PhD in the 1980s. And she did this show in 2000, which was all about both actual corsetry and fashion that has been inspired by corsetry. And in many ways, this exhibition explained the history of corsets, which were more or less worn by many women for about 400 years. And there's a lot of myths behind them, the idea of tight lacing and the 13-inch waist and all these things you may have heard. So a lot of her work on the corset was kind of myth busting. And whenever someone has a particular opinion on the corset, I always send them to her book that corresponded to this exhibition, because she really looked at extant objects in volume to get a sense of what the average waist size was, for example. So it's a really fascinating look at, again, an object that's kind of controversial in its history and continues to be. And here are just a few examples. You can see on the end are sort of fashionable versions of corsets and corset clothing, which extends all the way to a Stephen Jones hat that unfortunately you can't see very well here, but it's laced up like a corset. And then at the far right is this quote unquote iron corset that was very likely something that was just in a shop window, kind of as a play on the idea of corsets. It's not an actual iron corset. And then London Fashion is another show that Valerie put together in the early 21st century. And this was just showing the significance of London really from the 1960s to this present. And that's not to say that London had not been significant for centuries prior to that as a fashion capital. But it's really from this idea of kind of youth culture forward, and particularly as we get into the 90s with designers like John Galliano, Hussein Chalayan, Alexander McQueen, we really start to see this focus on London fashion that's very similar to the way people were quite obsessed with London during the 60s. So we got a number of really great loans for this show from people like McQueen, but it wasn't until a number of years later that we really started to collect McQueen. So to exemplify this show, we ended up using this beautiful dress by Ossie Clark, which gives more of that sort of youth culture vibe. In the center is an ensemble by Boudica, which was a design duo that created these really beautiful and kind of conceptual garments. And then on the right is a famous ensemble by Vivian Westwood. This is actually from her first runway collection. So this is when she's really starting to enter the fashion world. This was actually made in tandem with her then partner, Malcolm McLaren, but Westwood eventually branches out on her own and becomes known as the fashion designer. So this was from her famous Poiret collection, and it is a unisex garment. So we decided to dress it on a male mannequin. Sometimes we dress it on other mannequins. It's just kind of how we feel for the show. And Japan Fashion Now gives a sense of how we occasionally focus on a particular country or a particular city, as you saw in London Fashion. But I loved this show because it was really focused mostly on contemporary fashion, although we started in our introductory gallery by talking about some of the great fashion designers in Japan in the 80s, like Rei Kawakubo, who I mentioned earlier, but also people like Yohji Yamamoto and Issey Miyake, talking about how they really set the stage for this more avant-garde fashion and what we'll eventually see in the 90s is deconstruction. But as we get into the 21st century, this idea of, for example, menswear being so innovative and interesting in Japanese fashion was something that we really wanted to highlight. This kind of went by particular neighborhoods in Tokyo. So there were like Harajuku designs. There was some cosplay that we either purchased or borrowed for the exhibition. So it was really varied and showed that there was a lot of just really great and interesting design happening and still happening. And then here are just some examples of that. Some of the menswear we've collected on the far right. Some of the really beautiful Junya Watanabe pieces made from recycled denim on the left, and then kind of everything in between. One of the things we really like to focus on now as we collect for our permanent collection is this idea of avant-garde and directional fashion, and a lot of Japanese design falls into that category. So we have quite a large collection of Japanese fashion. And this was a show that I actually worked on with Valerie Steele. And this was a really fun one for me because it was the first time I was able to work in this space, which is our larger special exhibitions gallery, but also because it was a show entirely focused on 21st century fashion. And I'd never done something like that before. Of course, it's all about shoes, shoe obsession. And it was really at this moment in time when shoes were, to be honest, kind of ridiculous. They were really, really expensive and they were very, very high. And something like a 5-inch heel was considered to be kind of normal within high fashion footwear. And so Valerie and I wanted to explore why that was. And we ended up showing, I think it was about 150 distinct styles of shoes that all dated. I think the oldest one was from like 2008 all the way up to the present season. So it was kind of a fun way to engage with, of course, a very short period of time and a recent period of time, but also one particular type of object. And we did acquire some really, really beautiful pieces for this show. We have about 4,000 pairs of shoes in our collection. So again, a lot to choose from, but contemporary footwear is, of course, again, something that we are always looking to acquire. And a number of our shows have also focused on really important social and political topics. So a queer history of fashion was something that was uh, thought of by one of our curators, Fred Dennis, and he really wanted to show the contributions of the LGBTQ plus community in fashion, which is something that I would hope many people are aware of, but wasn't really ever the highlight of an exhibition before. And so this exhibition, unlike many of our shows, kind of went more chronological in its first kind of introduction and then went more thematic. But again, it was really the first of its kind. It had a tremendous impact on fashion exhibitions and really, again, helped to highlight some of our great collections. So I've included this image here, which shows a few related t-shirts. And these were things that were collected by Richard Martin. Again, just had a really brilliant mind for what was going to be, well, certainly important then, but would remain important in the future. And so we were able to replicate this and, of course, highlight a few really fantastic designers in this kind of small vignette. Elegance in an Age of Crisis is all focused on a particular time period, which is something that I kind of picked up, as you'll see a little later. And this was very heavily focused on our permanent collection and really just showed a number of ways that fashion, despite the fact that it was between these two world wars in the middle of the Great Depression, there were still many really beautiful high fashion and couture designs coming out of this. And it's a real time for modernity, kind of pushing fashion forward. This section shows a lot of the evening wear, but there are also great sections on menswear and sportswear and the idea of the modern bathing suit coming into fashion. So it really had a breadth of objects that I think was quite important. And here we've shown a few of these. I'll quickly talk about the dress on the left by Augusta Bernard, because that was something that we had hanging in what we call our general section because we did not know who designed it. It didn't have a label in it. But as we were working on this exhibition, one of my colleagues found this dress in Vogue, and it's most definitely an Augusta Bernard. So these kinds of finds happen as we're working on these exhibitions. There's always at least one, which is great. I did a show called Fairy Tale Fashion a number of years ago. This is the most straightforward section in that, which is obviously about Little Red Riding Hood. But I looked at 15 classic literary fairy tales and basically found examples that had references to dress or motifs like red roses or blonde hair, these things that come up a lot in fairy tales. And I ended up illustrating those stories using fashion, a mix of historic and contemporary clothes. So it was quite a different approach to how we usually do our shows. It wasn't a straightforward fashion history, but it was a really fun way to utilize fashion and interpret fashion quite differently. And one of the things we acquired for that was what we call our Big Red Riding Hood, which is on the left. I was lucky that I started working on the show and then everything came up fairy tales. So as I had started this, Comme des Garçons put this collection on the runway, so we immediately contacted them and were able to buy this Big Red Riding Hood ensemble. Black fashion designers was one of our most important shows in recent history. And as you can imagine, it's really highlighting the significant contributions of Black fashion designers throughout history. This was all permanent collection pieces, which I think is incredibly important. And just to give you a little sense of the title, this is about Black fashion designers globally. So that's why we chose not to use, for example, African American fashion designers. And it was grouped thematically, and it also talked about the contributions of models. And one of the things that the show really wanted to emphasize was that often there's this idea of quote unquote Black style or Black fashion being this kind of monolithic thing. And in fact, it's not. Much like anything, there are all sorts of designs, there's all sorts of talent and creativity and ideas. So the curators really wanted to show, again, the breadth of beauty and creativity within this community. And here are just some great examples shown in Exhibitionism by Duro, Olawu, Pierre Moss. We were just starting to collect his work at this time, and Scott Berry from 1973. And I'll try to speed up a little bit because I always get too chatty and I want time for questions, but I did a show called Paris Refashion. Very quickly, this was just about almost arguing against the often held notion that London was the only center for fashion during the 1960s. In fact, Paris remained incredibly important. And they also started to shift towards ready-to-wear, away from couture towards ready-to-wear during this time period, actually looking to the United States for a lot of ideas about how to do that. And another one of the things I wanted to point out, which I'll show a little bit here, was that in fact, designers like Yves Saint Laurent, who launched his ready-to-wear line, Rive Gauche, in 1965, he's often credited with kind of helping to create the ready-to-wear market within France. In fact, he's copying, to be honest, young women designers. Emmanuelle Kahn is a great example of that. She never designed couture. She always designed really desirable and reasonably accessible ready-to-wear garments. And a lot of couturiers, Yves Saint Laurent, Pierre Cardin, André Courrèges, they're all looking toward designers like Emmanuelle Kahn and frankly getting quite a lot of inspiration from her. So again, it's this kind of myth busting. No shade to Saint Laurent, he's fantastic, but it's good to look a little more closely at what exactly is happening amongst these designers. Force of Nature was one of my favorites. It was curated by my colleague Melissa Mera, and she really dove into not only fashion history, but also real science and biology and combined them in this really brilliant way. So it wasn't just about surface, but also about how, of course, we can make things like knit from algae and really getting into the myriad ways that science and fashion have overlapped really prominently since the 18th century. And so, for example, the man's jacket and waistcoat on the left, unfortunately, it's a little hard to see, but it has really intricate embroidery, floral embroidery, and it's quite naturalistic. And that's important because the idea of more precise biological renderings becomes part of 18th century culture, and that then gets translated into fashion. So there's a really direct correlation between nature and science and fashion during this period. And then I'll end here by one of the last or the most recent exhibitions that we featured in Exhibitionism. And this was curated by Emma McClendon, The Body, Fashion, and Physique. And she really explored the fashionable body type and the kind of idealized body, which of course can be very problematic from the 18th century to the present. And here she's included a number of the idealized dress forms from various periods. And in the center there is a Margiela dress form tunic, which is a kind of fashion version of this idea of the idealized body, kind of bringing to mind that perfect form and kind of arguing against it at the same time. And so here is how we have recreated that using, of course, the Margiela, but also what was then a relatively new acquisition by Chromat, which is playing on the idea of the cage that you see on the actual dress form to the left. Okay, so I think I'm done with my chatting and we'll leave it open for questions. Thank you so much.